Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Craig Kiger with Minnesota DNR Outreach, and today's episode is 143. You caught a what? Mudpuppies of Minnesota. And our two guest speakers, Krista Larson and Jeff LeClere from Minnesota DNR, are going to tell us all about that. So whoever would like to talk first, tell us a little bit about you and explain your presentation.
Sure, I'll start. My name is Jeff LeClere. I am an animal survey specialist for the Minnesota Biological Survey, and I specialize in amphibians and reptiles, also known as herps.
And I am Krista Larson. I also work for the Minnesota Biological Survey, and I'm a little bit more broad. My title is a non-game research biologist, so I do surveys, research, and monitoring on kind of all of our rare animal species. So anything from loons and eagles down to salamanders and turtles and dragonflies. But my specialty and my heart is in herps as well. The Minnesota Biological Survey is a program within the DNR that kind of focuses on rare species and their habitats, try to delineate where rare species still exist. So there's a plant component to MBS as well as Jeff and I on the animal side, and try to document those rare species and provide guidance to keep them from going extinct in the state. And today we're talking about pups, which are really cool.
Talking about pups. And today is very appropriately titled because you caught what? A lot of people aren't familiar with mud puppies, and when they catch them or they see them or they hear of them, they're not sure what they are. So we're going to kick off the talk this time by actually talking about what is a mud puppy. Well, when a lot of people hear the term mud puppy, they might think of this. But you know what? These are cute, but they're not mud puppies. These are just muddy puppies. And likewise, there's also something called a water dog. And when people think of water dogs, they might think of this. But guess what? These are not water dogs. These are dogs that are in the water. So in all seriousness, what are mud puppies and what are water dogs? Well, there's a lot of confusion around this. True mud puppies and water dogs belong to the genus Nycteris. And this genus contains roughly 6 or so species, depending on whose taxonomy you follow. And what a lot of people call mud puppies or water dogs sometimes are larval salamanders. So larval salamanders, including tiger salamander larvae, are not mud puppies and they're not water dogs, even though people may have referred to them as that. We can see why this might be, right? Because they're very similar to one another. Both have external gills and are aquatic. But there are some differences between the two. And the easiest way maybe to tell is that mud puppies have a paddle-like tail, with the tail fin being present on the tail only. And the eastern tiger salamander larva has a more pointed tail. And they have a very high tail fin that extends way, way up onto the back, actually. The other thing is that the mud puppy only has 4 toes on the hind feet versus the 5 toes on the hind feet of our larval salamanders that we have in our state, not only just tiger salamanders. And there are some differences in the habitat as well, which we'll get into a little bit later. Mud puppies prefer more lakes and rivers, whereas tiger salamander larvae are usually confined to things like ponds and sloughs and marshes and things like that. Also, tiger salamanders tend to have eyes that bulge out from the head, whereas mud puppies have very, very small inset eyes. We'll talk about the name too. How did mud puppies and water dogs get their names? That's kind of weird. Mud puppies and water dogs kind of got their name from 2 things. They're believed that they got their name because their faces kind of actually look like puppies or dogs. They have a very squared off long snout with a very prominent high forehead, and their gills oftentimes look like the ears of like a dog or a puppy. So there's that. But there's also, if you have mud puppies or water dogs out of the water for an extended period of time, sometimes they will start to make squawking or squeaking noises, sometimes like fish do, and that might sound like the bark of a dog or a puppy. So those are two areas or two thoughts as to why mud puppies and water dogs have the name that they do. All right, well, there are 8 salamander species in Minnesota, and only one of those mud puppy or water dog species are found in Minnesota, Necturus maculosus, the common mud puppy, and it's the only one found in Minnesota. They're also the largest salamander species in Minnesota, with specimens up to 16 inches long on average. These guys are fully aquatic, so they are completely neotenic, which means that they never lose their gills. They always must be in the water from when they're hatched all the way to adulthood. Even though they have lungs, they cannot breathe out of the water. So these guys also are not made in any way to travel on land. They never move over land at all. All the corridors that they use to disperse are in the water. And we'll talk about this more coming up, but this is why things like dams and other aquatic barriers might impede movements of mud puppies. These guys eat just about anything that is smaller than themselves. Many, many types of small aquatic invertebrates and vertebrates are known in their diet. So they eat a lot of crustaceans, including crayfish. They also eat a lot of snails, but they also will consume other smaller mud puppies. So they are known to be cannibalistic, which is a little bit weird to think of. But again, these guys are pretty voracious feeders. They use pretty much their sense of smell to find most of their food. And they also are known to have a lateral line, which are, electric receptor sensors that they use to not only detect food, but they also can detect predators this way. And so that will alert them if there's danger nearby. The other weird thing about these guys is that they are super slimy. They have a very, very thick slime coat and are very slippery. So if you ever have the opportunity to hold a mud puppy, you probably won't be holding it for long because they can just slide right out of your hands. Mud puppy habitats. These guys like medium to large rivers, and in western Minnesota, they're also found in lakes as well. In general, and of course, we'll talk a little bit more about their distribution, but they're pretty much within the Mississippi, Minnesota, Red, and St. Croix River basins. And we often think of them as being associated with rocky substrates for cover. And this rocky substrates can consist of either single or piled slab rock or boulders that are piled on top of each other. And mud puppies really like to gather and congregate in those areas because it's sort of like they live in these kind of Swiss cheese houses with all of their nooks and crannies and crevices. And if you could just think of a mud puppy just slinking through and sliding through all of those Swiss cheese crevices, it really helps protect them from predators. And also it helps them find their food because a lot of their food likes to lurk in those same areas. So we often think of them associated with these rocky habitats, although we have observed mud puppies more or less in the open in just gravelly open areas or sandy open areas or areas with mud just wandering around with no apparent big structure nearby. So as you can see, mud puppies are found mostly in the eastern part of the United States, again within those rivers and those lake systems. And water dogs, on the other hand, are found mostly to the south of the mud puppy range. But you can see that, again, mud puppies mostly in the eastern part of the United States. You can see here their Minnesota distribution. Again, a lot of those in the eastern part of their range there are in river systems, and then they follow the Minnesota River to the west. And if you see that column of western counties, those are a lot of lake habitats where mud puppies may live. But more on that later. Oops, I didn't want that. I wanted this. So one of the most interesting thing about mud puppies and things that I think set them apart from all other herps or reptiles and amphibians that we have in the state, with the exception of the eastern newt, is that mud puppies are active year round. And as a matter of fact, they're most active in the winter. So that's kind of weird. In the fall, mud puppies oftentimes move into shallow water and start to congregate. And this is when most of their mating and courtship take place, is in the fall, with some sporadic matings and courting going on in the middle of the winter and even a little bit in the early spring. But most of their mating occurs in the fall. And so during this whole time, they're in those shallow areas, feeding and breeding. Then as the water warms up in the summer, most of them move into deeper water, presumably to keep cool, because they like really cold temperatures, if you haven't figured that out. Nocturnal, they're mostly nocturnal, or most references will say they're nocturnal, but this may be more dependent on where actually they're found and what type of environments they're found in. So if they're found in more muddy waters or deeper, darker waters, they may be more likely to be active during the day. I know I've seen them out wandering around in rivers without any apparent cover nearby, just wandering around during the day in sunny times. So although we say that they're primarily nocturnal, there certainly are exceptions to this rule. Oops, I keep doing that. There we go. All right, so even though most of their breeding takes place in the fall, the female stores sperm until the spring. So in sometime in May or June, she'll find like a rock or under a log or under a board or sometimes inside a hollow log or other structure, and she'll actually flip upside down and attach the eggs to the roof of the nest. So as you can see in this photo, the eggs actually are hanging upside down and are suspended. They lay anywhere from around 50 to a little bit more than 100 eggs in a single nest. And the female will stay and guard the nest from other predators and also other mud puppies, and also to help aerate that nest too and kind of keep those eggs healthy. The eggs will hatch in July or August, roughly, and the young don't really look like the adults. The young are mostly dark, like a black or a brown, with two bright yellow stripes down each side of the body. The young pups will mature in probably right around 5 years or so. This is very, very rough. It has to do more with their size than it really does their age. But on average, that occurs right around 5 years of age. They're relatively long-lived. These guys are known to live 15 years or more. They've been recorded as living over 20 years. So they are pretty long-lived, even though they mature at a relatively young age. So despite this, they have many predators. So a lot of different things eat mud puppies. Large predaceous fish love mud puppies. Things like snapping turtles, aquatic snakes, such as water snakes, will eat mud puppies. A lot of different birds eat mud puppies. Some mammals, like otters and mink, will eat mud puppies if they can catch them. And humans are not exempt from this list. Humans are known to catch mud puppies and fry up the tails and the flanks. I don't know how good they taste, but we are known predators of mud puppies. And, you know, just other than that, and like we even mentioned before, other mud puppies are predators of mud puppies. So they do have a lot of predators. And they also do not produce a venom or a poison or anything like that. So actually, mud puppies are quite palatable to a lot of different predators. Another really interesting thing about these guys is that they are the only known larval host for the salamander mussel. And Krista is going to tell us more about that.
Yeah, so one of the questions, I'm sure Jeff, you get this a lot in the field too, when we're doing our survey work, is people want to know, what good is this animal, or why should I care? And mud puppies are a really cool creature for that because there's so many reasons to care about mud puppies, not just because they're indicators of water quality, that they're important to the ecosystem. A lot of predators depend on them, but there's a specific species of mussel that completely depends on the mud puppy for survival. So salamander mussels are listed as state endangered in Minnesota. They're being proposed for federally listing as endangered, and they're found in the exact same habitats as mud puppies are, which is really neat. So they're only found under these big slab rocks, in crevices of bedrock, or in ledges of rock walls. And if anybody knows anything about the life cycle of a mussel, it's really neat. I think Cassandra was going to post a link to one of the other outdoor skills webinars that we've had on mussels, and it's definitely worth a watch because the life cycle of mussels are neat. They have all these cool reproductive strategies to try to get their larvae out there. But the general life cycle is you have a male, let me use my cursor here, male mussel here that emits sperm into the water, and a female mussel that is gravid or with eggs can siphon in, just like they siphon in particles, they can siphon in that sperm and fertilize their eggs. At some point later, the female, after brooding these eggs in their gills, will expel these little larvae called glaucidia into the water column. And in this case, a mud puppy is the one, is the host that's needed for these larvae to attach onto the gills. So any other species of mussel in North America uses a fish host, but the salamander mussel depends on the mud puppy and mud puppy only, which makes it really unique. So if we don't have mud puppies, we're not going to have salamander mussels. After these mussels grow on the gills of the mud puppy, they turn into juvenile mussels, at which case they fall off of the gills and they become free-living mussels back on the riverbed. So super cool interaction and worth looking into more on mussels if you had interest in that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now kind of about our survey work and give you some more information on kind of their status and distribution in the state. So mud puppies require a very specialized technique to find them. So during our typical surveys for amphibians and reptiles, you're not going to come up with a mud puppy in those survey efforts. You have to target them using a specific technique. So we decided to try trapping surveys, and we did this kind of statewide. So it wasn't a very intensive effort in any one location, but trying to cast a broad net and figure out where in the state are these guys present and get some general idea of their abundance. And so the photos that you see here, we were hitting either by watercraft, some of the big rivers like the Minnesota and Mississippi river drainages, the main stems hitting rocky areas of habitat. You see on the left photo here, one of the DNR staff members holding a minnow trap. And this was what we used to catch the mud puppies. We modified the openings of the minnow traps to be a little bit larger so these salamanders could get inside. And we would set the traps for a couple of nights in areas of rocky habitat. We would try to do this in the fall because supervisors get very nervous if you tell them that you want to go out on the ice in the middle of winter on a river. So we would hit that kind of time period right before ice on. So the water temperatures were cold, mud puppies were active, but it was still safe for us to do the surveys. The middle picture there is me having to jump up and down, trying to get our traps out of the river after it did ice over while they were out. The right photo is setting traps in the middle of the winter on lakes. So on lakes, it's much safer to do winter surveys where you can chainsaw or auger holes through the ice to set traps. So we use the same type of technique, but we're mostly doing roadside surveys where we would drive, hit bridge crossings, public parks, county parks, local parks, water access points to set traps and see if mud puppies were present. And just some basic results, kind of split these into by major watershed basins. And there's a lot of ways you can collapse or categorize watersheds, but we used 8 major watershed basins. 5 are listed here because they're the only 5 that known to have mud puppies. So the St. Croix River watershed basin, I'll show a map on the next page, but it's basically the St. Croix River main stem as well as the tributaries that feed into it. So in the St. Croix River basin, mud puppies seem to be pretty common. So out of the 80 or so sites that we trapped, we caught about 140 individuals, and about 25% of all the traps that we set had at least one mud puppy in it. So they seem to be widespread. They seem to be healthy populations there. The Minnesota river drainage was actually a pleasant surprise. As Jeff talked about a little bit about their habitat needs, amphibians in general are thought to be pretty sensitive to changes in water quality, and mud puppies, since they depend on these cover objects for refuge and for nesting, siltation can bury some of those cover objects and make them unusable for mud puppies. So going into the Minnesota River drainage surveys, I was a little concerned about some of the runoff and sedimentation issues that the Minnesota River has, that it might not be good mud puppy habitat, and that they may have declined in that drainage. But we actually caught quite a few. We caught about almost 300 mud puppies in about 15% of all the traps. And again, this is the Minnesota River main stem as well as the main tributaries that feed into it. Upper Mississippi drainage, it's a little misleading. We only surveyed the area downstream of the St. Anthony Falls Dam because the St. Anthony Falls Dam is thought to be a barrier where mud puppies really are not present in the upper parts of that drainage. So we just surveyed from the St. Anthony Falls Dam down to the Hastings Lock and Dam 2. And again, about 15% of all the traps had mud puppies. They seem to be relatively common. Whereas the Red River drainage and the lower Mississippi drainage, they were pretty rare. So there was pockets where they were present or possibly even locally abundant in small sections of the rivers. But for the most part, they were pretty difficult to come by. So here's kind of the similar information on a statewide map, and it's very colorful. Each of the watersheds is shaded a different color. You can see this one lists 8 watersheds. So the 3 watersheds that are not known to have any mud puppies are this Rainy River drainage up in the pink on the top, the Great Lakes drainage in orange in the northeastern part of the state, and the Missouri River drainage down in the very southwestern corner are not known to have mud puppies, so we didn't do any survey work there. But on this map, any of the yellow dots are areas that we set traps to survey for mud puppies, and the black dots are those spots where we found them. So for example, you can see in the Red River drainage, we had pretty good coverage surveying across the entire Red River main stem, all the way up to the Canada border, as well as most of the large tributaries. But mud puppies were only found in a handful of pockets. And so they might be present in areas where we didn't find them. So the fact that there's not a black dot does not mean that they're not there, but they're probably pretty rare. Whereas drainages like the St. Croix River drainage here in the green on the eastern central part of the state, they were very widespread, seem to be doing really well. And just one more graphic here on distribution. I just want to say a huge thank you to the public. So when we embarked on this survey effort to try to understand their distribution and abundance, we also asked the public to please submit reports of any mud puppies they found. And the green shaded counties are all the counties that we have verified records, and the yellow triangles are all the places the public has sent in reports. And this has been just really instrumental in helping us fill in gaps in our survey knowledge, reinforce areas where we caught mud puppies that we now know they're more abundant because we have additional records from there. And it's really been helpful at getting a handle on areas that we might want to prioritize for future survey efforts. So a huge thank you to those of you who have sent in information to us to help us better understand how they're doing in the state. And now I'm going to go into a little bit of conservation. So why are we concerned about mud puppies? So yeah, they're super cool. Hopefully we've convinced you of that, but we also have some conservation concerns. So they are listed as a state species of special concern in Minnesota. Some of the threats, as we've already talked about, are like habitat fragmentation, for example, dams that prevent movement, siltation and pollution, and that's a threat to a lot of our amphibians, and also exploitation by humans. Although I have to say this exploitation by humans is, that concern is now minimized. So back in 2017, we added salamanders to the Minnesota State Statute of Protected Wild Animal. So salamanders are now protected, which means they can no longer be collected, killed, taken, possessed, transported from the wild without some sort of permit. And so in the past, mud puppies were taken in large numbers for the biological supply companies. For example, universities and colleges would do for teaching, for research, for dissections. They were sold in large numbers. The bait industry used them a lot, and certainly there was some percentage of mud puppies that would get killed in the winter from anglers that would throw them up on the ice thinking that they were venomous or harmful. And that is no longer legal to do. So mud puppies now have this protection as being a protected wild animal. One of the other things that was very eye-opening in these public reports we were getting for the last 10 years is people were reporting mud puppies, but they were reporting dead mud puppies. And so we got these concerns of these mystery die-offs that we're still trying to better understand. And so this is a concern of ours. Cliffhanger, we don't really have answers yet, but I at least wanted to bring up that this is going on. And talk a little bit about what we're seeing. So for the last 10 years or so, as we've been collecting reports of mud puppies across the state, we've been getting reports of die-offs. So these die-offs are occurring in this red circled area in lakes. And so each of these purple triangles is a report of a die-off from the public in west central Minnesota. Most of these die-offs have been just mud puppies only, but some of the mortality events have also included other species of fish and or crayfish. Sometimes the mortality event was just in the tens of individuals. Sometimes it was in the thousands of individuals. So we consider a die-off or a mortality event to be 5 or more animals of the same species that are found dead at the same time. So kind of same place, same time. A single mud puppy dead is, going to be a natural occurrence, isn't a cause for concern, but a concentration of dead mud puppies in one area at one time is a cause for concern. Some of the obstacles that we've been experiencing are that fresh specimens are really hard to get. So by the time a mud puppy dies, floats to the surface of the water, and then makes its way through wind and wave action to a landowner's shoreline, it's pretty well decomposed. And even if it looks intact to the naked eye, by the time we send it to a lab for processing, the results are inconclusive because a lot of deterioration has set in and it's tough to get good results. To exacerbate that problem, a lot of the reports come in on the weekends or the 4th of July holiday. So the interesting thing about these mortality events is they're not occurring right after ice out. So it's not like a winter kill event that we see in fish sometimes after ice out. And it's also not the peak of summer heat. So it's not when water temperatures are the highest. They start coming in June and they kind of peak around the 4th of July and quickly peter off. So it's an interesting timing of the mortality events. So what do we know? So all I can really tell you for sure at this point is that of the specimens that we've sent in for testing, we've sent in dead mud puppies from about 8 different lakes in that part of the state. And in 4 of those 8 lakes, the lab has detected a bacteria that seems to be associated with die-off events. So it's not the cause of the die-off events, but associated. So this bacteria called Edwardsiella piscicida was found on dead mud puppies in 4 of these lakes. We went back to these same lakes in the winter. So after that die-off event, a few months later, we went back to the lake. We collected mud puppies in the winter. We swabbed their skin and sent it in for testing. And we didn't find any evidence of the bacteria on the skin of healthy animals from these same lakes that had die-off events. So the bacteria seems to be associated with sick or dying animals, but not of healthy animals. The lab did one more step where they did an experimental exposure, where they exposed mud puppies to this bacteria and found that it did not cause any infection, illness, or death. So when you expose a healthy mud puppy to this bacteria, there doesn't seem to be any issues. So our working hypothesis, even though we're really not sure what's happening yet, is this bacteria does seem to be associated, but we think it might be a secondary pathogen that really only causes illness or mortality after there's another primary stressor that triggers the event. But what that primary stressor is, we don't know. And so I just want to put in a plug to please continue to report these die-off events, or if you know anybody that lives up in that lake country area, the hotspot seems to be from the north side is like Detroit Lakes area in Becker County, kind of goes through Battle Lake, Alexandria down to Glenwood. That kind of seems to be the hotspot. And there's not die-offs every year. There's not large-scale die-offs every year. It kind of ebbs and flows, but some years we get a number of reports, and it's really important that we continue to get those and try to respond as quickly as possible so we can come up with some answers to what might be happening. Okay.
All right.
Want to wrap us up?
Yeah, let's wrap it up for pups. As much as we love them, there does have to be a wrap up. So mud puppies are thought to be an indicator of water quality. So that makes them, interesting in and of themselves. But really, all that we've shared today, we still don't know a whole lot about mud puppies. There's a lot more to learn about mud puppies. And I think they are one of the most interesting and unique salamander and just overall herp species in the state of Minnesota. And not only people in Minnesota feel this way, but mud puppies throughout their range, other states have been wanting to study more and find out more about mud puppies just in the recent years here. So this really is something that a lot of other states are taking an interest in, I guess, as well too throughout this time. And just one of the interesting things that states are taking a look at is not only do they want to know about mud puppy movements and dispersal and things like that, but they also are trying to do some genetic work. And a few people have been doing genetic work with mud puppies across their range, thanks to Katie Greenwald for these slides and these analysis results here. But in general, a couple of studies have found that mud puppies across their range have pretty healthy genetic stable populations. And one of the very interesting thing about this is that there's strong population structure with lots of differentiation in the different sample sites, which indicates that although these landscape is strong genetically, that individual mud puppies are not moving across the landscape in large scale. They are pretty much confined genetically to their areas or their population. So very, very interesting. Of course, there has to be a lot more work done, and we need a lot more samples. So this is one area where we can look at mud puppies and basically their natural history in the future. Another thing is, of course, those movements. How far do individual mud puppies go? How robust are these populations? And just basically just interactions, better interactions with them and adjoining mud puppy populations. And with that, we thank you. And I guess we are ready for questions.
I'm ready.
All right. I am too.
Wow, did you guys cover a lot of information? We've got quite a few questions that have come in already. So we'll go to the top of the list. David says it's interesting mud puppies are commonly found in Lake Michigan watershed in Wisconsin, but not in Lake Superior's watershed. We just haven't looked there yet, or?
No, they are in Lake Superior. So if you, especially toward the Wisconsin side of Lake Superior, there are some bays that have good mud puppy populations, but he is correct in that they do not seem to be evenly distributed in that commonality across Lake Superior. So you can't just go anywhere into Lake Superior and find good populations of mud puppies, but they're there.
Okay. Joe was going to comment that I'm from northeast South Dakota. We have mud puppies in our dugouts way up in the hills of Wilmot, Marvin, and Summit areas, quite a distance from the Minnesota River, and they've been there for at least 40 years that I'm aware of. Great class, thanks.
Oh, well, thank you, Joe. I would double check to make sure that those are not tiger salamander larvae. Out there, they would be western tiger salamanders. And an interesting thing to point out about that is that some of those populations can be completely neotenic or partially neotenic, which means that some of those larval tiger salamanders will actually keep their larval characteristics, but become sexually mature and actually breed and reproduce in the water. So that can be very confusing. But again, if you take a look at those specimens and just like count the toes on the hind feet or use some of these other characteristics, they can be readily separated from mud puppies. And I believe from his description that that is what they probably are.
Okay. So I think the folks have had a chance to jot down your email addresses there. Both of them will end state.mn.us.
Where am I going here?
So yeah, just
It's the same
first name,
mine. It's just
dot last name, and at state.mn. So you guys can go ahead and shut that down so you can get the big part of the screen up there now.
okay.
So stop sharing.
Yep, stop sharing.
Got it. All right.
There we go. Look at that. Let's see here. William Johnson said, if we find a dead mud puppy, should we freeze it?
Well, it's a good question. Freezing, freezing can be helpful. The quickest thing is to report it. We do have instructions that I can send. Please send me a note. I can give you instructions on how to safely collect it and freeze it. We're trying to respond. What we have found, some of the best specimens that we've been able to send into the lab are kind of ongoing die-offs where, yes, there's already dead individuals, but we can actually find some that are still living but sick. So some of those that we've been sending in, getting the best results from, are during this ongoing effort. So the biggest thing would be to make sure that we can kind of get there while the event is still ongoing. But yes, certainly freezing a handful of specimens, if they're really fresh, could be super helpful. And so I can send in instructions on how to do that. And then we can send them in for processing.
Very good. Peter you said the bacterial die-off occurs in June, July, and that the mud puppies prefer cold water. Could the stressor be the rising temps of summer?
It's possible. Right now, I have lots of working hypotheses, none of which I have any evidence that are correct. So, it's not happening in the peak of the summer where the water is the highest. So certainly we know that mud puppies are more active in the winter. They've got these big red fluffy gills that they take in their oxygen in. So as the water gets warmer and holds less oxygen, the mud puppies are less active. So there is an association there, but it's not happening at the peak of the temperature. So possibly it's after maybe a big warm spell where the water is warming very quickly and they're just not keeping up with that. That's a possibility. A lot of the mud puppies that are dead are very emaciated and seem to have been in starvation mode. So they were not very healthy going into that mortality event. So it certainly could be a stressor like temperatures. It could be a stressor like some sort of like heavy wind or wave action. A lot of the die-offs have been reported after maybe a heavy storm. So there still is potential there that it's something a little bit more benign, that's happening than some type of disease outbreak or something.
Okay. Mary said, I've recently read about aloxy. She's not sure on the spelling. A-X-O-L.
Oh, axolotls.
Yep.
Which are present and threatened around Mexico City. Are these amphibians in the same genus as mud puppies?
No, they're not. They're actually more closely related to tiger salamanders than they are mud puppies. They're in a completely different genus, and really are not like mud puppies at all. They're both salamanders, of course, but that's pretty much where it stops. Like I said before, they're actually more closely related to and more closely resemble tiger salamanders.
Okay.
They're really neat though. They're threatened in
Yes.
nature, but they're captive bred and found used a lot in research. So
Yeah.
one of the really cool things about salamanders, axolotls specifically, is that they have this amazing regenerative ability. So they can regenerate not only limbs, tails, but even entire organs.
Yeah, the
And
eyes,
as
everything.
Salamanders
Wow.
really have a lot of interest for public health and for medical research. And so there's a lot of reasons to care about our native salamanders.
Axolotls are very popular in the pet trade. So they are being bred in large numbers. Again, like I said, most of these are captive bred in captivity. So, but they are very popular as pets.
Cool. Peter wants to know, how social are mud puppies? Are they ever found in groups in the wild?
Oh, yes, they are found in groups, especially during those during those times in the fall and in the winter when they congregate in those shallower waters. It is a congregation with a lot of mud puppies together in just the same general area. So yes, they can be social at different times in their active period. Now, once they disperse from that in the summer, they may be a little more solitary. They have been found in deep holes in rivers and lakes, and sometimes up to 30, 40, even 90 feet deep. And when they have like certain specific holes like that, there may be a number of mud puppies together, even in that time of the year. But in general, if you're talking about like a river system or something like that, they tend to be a little more solitary during those summer months.
Okay. Bill said you had a triangle on the edge of Clearwater County. Was this Clearwater Lake? We have a cabin on there for many years, and I think I've seen them there before, but not recently.
I can't remember offhand. I know we did survey the Clearwater River and got a record from there. I'm not sure if that public report was from Clearwater Lake. If he thinks of it, send me a note, because that might not be a lake that we have a record for. Certainly there's a lot of places we still have to fill in, and so I'd be interested in talking more about that.
And you know, even if you see an area on there that already has a triangle, it's worth reporting one whenever you find one anyway, because that kind of gives us a sense of that size of that population too. So even if you think it's already been reported from a certain area, we'll go ahead and report it if you find one.
The only caveat I would give to that is the St. Croix River.
Yeah, maybe the St. Croix.
Between the St. Croix River, between Taylor's Falls and Prescott seems to be the hot spot. I know if there's any sturgeon fishermen on this webinar right now, they may be annoyed by them. The St. Croix River has a lot of mud puppies, and if you're fishing on the bottom for walleye or sturgeon, you've probably caught them, and they've probably stolen your bait. So that area of the state, we know is doing really well, and we probably don't need additional records, although if you send one in, I will absolutely still submit it to the database. But that's a spot that we know pretty well. But everywhere else is still important to try to help us fill in our knowledge gaps.
Leah wants to know, what's the thought on why the species isn't located north of the St. Anthony Dam?
So the St. Anthony Dam is thought to be a natural barrier. And because it's not a man-made dam that was put in place by us, there were no populations north of that. This is the thought anyway. There were no populations north of that because they didn't disperse past St. Anthony Falls.
Okay. So Jeff wants to know, there's a long history of anglers in west central Minnesota using mud puppies and salamander larvae as bait for catching big walleyes and northerns. It sounds like that is no longer legal to use them for fishing bait.
That is correct. Since 2017, that they're now considered protected, so that they're no longer allowed to be taken and used for bait. And I believe that there is an update to that effect in the fishing regulations book on whether you can take salamanders. So I could check that for more information.
Joe added, yeah, they should be. Karen, what's the answer? What was the answer to the mud puppy versus water dog? Just two names for the same species?
So that one is a little bit more muddy to say, but in general, what we have here in Minnesota are commonly referred to, the common name is mud puppy. And there's another species called the Red River mud puppy, and that's its actual common name. And then the rest of those species, those 6 species that I talked about, so roughly 4 that are found in the south and southeastern part of the United States, are referred to as water dogs, and their common name is some type of water dog, the black warrior water dog, and so forth and so on. So they are essentially called mud puppies in the north, water dogs in the south. What they are not other types of salamanders or salamander larvae that are in different genera. Like, for instance, our tiger salamanders, which are ambystoma.
Matthew asked a very interesting question here, and I'll probably butcher the first part. Neotenic?
Yeah, neotenic.
Okay, tiger salamanders be host for the salamander clam larvae.
No, so they're not found in the same habitats. So salamander mussels are found in rivers. Tiger salamander larvae are not. And so the only known host, at least I know that there's been mussel trials. You know, a lot of times they're trying to figure out what the host fish or the host species for a given mussel is. And so they'll bring in different fish into a lab, in this case, mud puppy, and see if the larvae will attach to the gills. And there is no other known species that will have attachment of that mussel on their gills other than mud puppies. So it seems to be unique.
Okay.
And it said there's no other native salamander that would be found in the same habitat as the salamander mussel.
Right. All of the other salamander species wouldn't, reproduce or be found in those river habitats like that.
Okay. Cassie sent me a comment here, so I'll see if I can find it. Well, I don't see it, Cassie. I'm sorry.
They're great questions. Super fun.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked into lead or mercury poisoning on impacting mud puppies?
We have not.
No. Nope. We haven't.
So listening to you guys, St. Croix River is probably the best place to see one incidentally caught trying to catch a walleye or a sturgeon.
Mhm.
Do they bite on minnows?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So I think
There you go, huh?
anytime somebody reports one that they caught fishing, I typically ask them questions about how deep were they fishing, what were they using as their bait, and
Mm-hmm.
by and large, it's somebody using live bait like minnows or an earthworm.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to love that, especially if they're fishing tight on the bottom of a lake or a river for a particular species like walleye or sturgeon.
Lots of
mud
walleye
puppies
fishing.
love going for that.
Yep.
And often, I don't know if I'd say often, I've never caught one, so I can't say how easy they are to take off of a hook, but often the photos that we get, the mud puppy isn't even hooked. They just latch on to that worm or to that minnow and they get pulled up just by their mouth because they don't want to let go of that food that they've got in their mouth. They're not even hooked. They're just kind of balled up, all slimed and curled
It's a
around.
big, juicy minnow.
It
I don't want to let that go. That's a good meal.
Karen wanted to know, do the mussel larvae hurt the mud puppies?
No, so they are technically considered parasitic. You know, all mussel larvae are considered parasites on their host fish, but they really don't cause any damage. So they just kind of use them to clamp on, use them for dispersal and to grow, so that they can drop off in new places. Like I said, mussels can't really disperse any other way, so that's kind of their tactic to move to a new location and start another mussel bed. But it doesn't impact the mud puppy, or other mussels aren't impacting the fish.
The host, yeah.
Yeah, the other host fish.
Guys, this has been incredibly interesting and just been a lot of fun. What's the future for mud puppies look like?
Well, that again is another muddy question. We have to navigate the waters to find to find out. So here's the interesting thing about this. I would have to say that again, I'll point out that just in fairly recent years, many states are really taking an interest in their mud puppy populations, wanting to know more about mud puppies and their associated habitats. In the past, really, mud puppies have kind of been overlooked. And so I think what the future holds for mud puppies is a lot more information starting to come out as more and more states are starting to delve into the specifics of mud puppy populations in their area. And one of the interesting things I'd like to point out about that is that a lot of the information that we've talked about today pertains to mud puppy populations in Minnesota, here in Minnesota and right around this region. There are some slight differences, like if you go to mud puppy populations in New York, or you go to mud puppy populations just somewhere farther east. They don't necessarily behave exactly the same way. They don't necessarily, there's little different components to their habitats that are just a little bit different than what we see here. And even Wisconsin, I mean, if you go over into Wisconsin, they're found statewide in Wisconsin. I mean, there any lake or any river is thought to have mud puppy populations in Wisconsin. So even from here to Wisconsin, there are differences. So I think those are going to be teased out more and more as these states start to look at their mud puppy populations a little more closely.
And I would add in just a little bit for on the Minnesota side, we're now set up really well with this baseline survey that we did about 10 years ago. we now have some information that we can compare it to in the future, because we had never done mud puppy surveys before to know how widespread they were or how common they were. So now we have a point of reference. So if they start to decline, we might be able to detect that by doing some long-term monitoring of sites where we know that they're present. The other thing that is generating some interest now is because the salamander mussel is being considered for federal listing. There's a lot of concern that, well, how are mud puppy populations doing in these spots where there's salamander mussels? And so there's talk in other states, at least, of maybe reintroducing mud puppies to areas where they've been extirpated because they want to repopulate the mussel. And there's no way of doing that without the host. And they're talking about some fancy techniques like environmental DNA, if anybody has heard of that, where you can sample the water and filter the water and try to detect DNA from an organism by sampling water. So we do that with, zebra mussels in Minnesota or things like invasive carp.
Sure.
But the technique is, we're talking about maybe starting to use that technique for sampling water for mud puppies. So rather than having to do this intense survey effort and try to catch them, can we just sample water, detect that they're there, and then that would give us information about whether that stretch of river would be suitable for salamander mussels to survive. So there's a lot of kind of new techniques that are being used to make survey effort and get information a little bit easier than in the past.
Julie snuck in one last question here. Have the mud puppy populations in other states have die-offs as well?
The only other state that I know for sure that has experienced similar die-offs is Michigan. I can't remember if it was Lake Michigan or a river population nearby, but what we were sending our specimens to the same lab in Madison that the Michigan folks were sending their specimens to. So once we were able to detect this bacteria off of some of our specimens, they went back and tested the Michigan specimens that were sent in and also detected the bacteria from their specimens. Again, it's not necessarily an answer that that's a smoking gun. It seems to be an association, but that's the only other population that I know of with die-offs.
I'll tentatively add Iowa to that list too.
Okay.
Maybe not to the scale as they are in Minnesota or Michigan, but I'll just add that.
Bill slipped in a question as well. What type of food do mud puppies eat?
Oh,
Anything they can catch?
Whatever they can fit in
Yeah,
their
pretty
mouth.
much whatever they can fit in their mouth. Like mud puppies have surprisingly strong jaws. And so basically most of their diet consists of small aquatic invertebrates, such as aquatic insects or larval insects. And then they really do seem to prefer like crustaceans, like crayfish and snails and things like that for the bulk of their diet here as well. Although they will eat pretty much anything that they can catch. So like I said, other mud puppies have been recorded in their diets. There's even reports of mud puppies eating baby turtles. So they are voracious. They will eat, whatever they feel that they can catch and swallow. Although those other things I do want to point out are not the bulk of their diet. The bulk of their diet is small fish, crayfish, snails, and earthworms.
Can you believe our hour is almost up?
It was fun.
Yeah. So I just want to remind everybody that next week, episode 144 is on the Aurora Borealis. I mean, we have had some incredible light shows up here in northern Minnesota in the past few months. So if you're interested in the northern lights, please sign up for that video, episode 144. And with that, I think we'll call it a show. Guys, thank you so much. You did awesome. Very intelligent on your topic and very entertaining.
Thank you.
So Cassie, if you can
Thank you.
take us back to the green room, that'd be great.